everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider podcast. I'm Christian Bicassa, your host, and today we have Lance Kittle on the line. Lance is owner, operator, creator. I don't know what you want to call yourself these days. There's a lot of titles out there, Lance, but you run the Pesca Vida Instagram page, YouTube, TikTok, etc. And really, your page focuses a lot on fly tying, etc. But there's quite a few other skills that you specialize in. And I would say a lot of them are really oriented towards the creative side of fly fishing. So we're going to dive into a lot of those scenarios. And I think our first subject area is really the creative arts side of fly fishing. And then at the end of the show, our tips section, we're going to jump into a handful of tips that you have with regard to products and materials, et cetera, that you can pick up outside of a fly fishing shop and how to use them. So I think we're going to touch base for a lot of people because, you know, we were all at one time probably broke high school or college kids and or adults, myself, that got into fly fishing, et cetera, and could utilize those types of tools. So looking forward to that. Now, before I pass the mic to you and we get going on the show, I just wanted to do a little catch up with the listeners out there. One thing I would highly suggest, and especially this time of year when everybody's pumped on fly fishing and you're getting out on a regular basis, to keep that stoke going, get yourself extra motivated, etc. I highly recommend you go check out the flyfishermanschannel.com. I've partnered with the flyfishermanschannel.com, and what it is the largest fly fishing specific, only fly fishing content online that is streamable. You can go on and stream all the movies from all the shows that go around, etc. These are also shows and movies, YouTube channels, etc., from around the globe. So it's not just US based, but all over the place. And man, it's awesome. I mean, I've gotten on there and just watched stuff, or I can figure out like, oh, I'm going to this area and I can go watch a movie about the area or that type of species, etc., and get all kinds of data. And it's super cheap. So go check that out. It's the flyfishermanschannel.com. And then if you're on our YouTube channel, I usually have a discount code, or affiliate code in the YouTube channel notes. Yeah, I get paid on it. If you make a subscription, it's, a great thing for me, keeps me, able to run the podcast, etc. And the guys over there at Fly Fisherman's Channel are absolutely fantastic. So, by all means, go check it out. You can do a demo, etc. I think you'll really enjoy it. All right. Now, Lance, you were a broke college kid. You have a background in conservation. You got into fly tying, but one of your true passions is actually rod building in the creative side. So give us a little bit about your background first and talk about this conservation effort that you're working with. And we also know I'm going to bring you back and we're going to talk in detail about that. So don't give us too much, just a little teaser here. Okay.
Absolutely, Christian. Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's always super fun to pop on and talk about one of my biggest passions, which is fly fishing. And really that passion stemmed from my background in conservation, like you mentioned. I have an undergraduate degree in environmental biology and ecology. I also hold a master's degree in global sustainability, and I currently serve as the executive director of the Inland Ocean Coalition, which sounds quite funny, right? I get a lot of questions about that name,
Right.
but really our focus is uniting the inland and the coasts and protecting the watersheds that serve all of humanity, as well as the ocean inevitably as well. So that's kind of my elevator pitch. I'll save that for the next episode that we get to chat.
Yeah, but it's an interesting area of focus because it's one of the richest environments, right?
Absolutely.
That connection. So I'm excited to talk about that in more detail. We'll save that again for the next show. But you have this passion for fly fishing, so Pesca Vida, I think for me, it's a little more known for the fly tying, but you're a rod builder. Talk about the creative side for you and how it's really fostered your, relationship with fly fishing in particular.
Yeah. So I started rod building, way back in it must have been the winter of 2017, very early, January, February of that year. It was particularly cold. I was living in Gunnison, Colorado, so there wasn't too much to do outside of snowboarding and hanging out with friends, right? So one day at work, I got a little bored and started thinking about how fly rods were actually made, serving, not only myself in that kind of context, because I really wanted to learn how to make rods, but is there a
Mm-hmm.
business side to that? What does that look like, right? So, uh, total can of worms I opened up for myself that led me to kind of where I am today with building rods and working alongside companies. But really, rod building for me started out as just another form of how do I do this myself in fly fishing, and that
Yeah.
is very closely related to fly tying, right? You see folks coming up with their own pack systems, the whole 9 yards. So that's where rod building really fits in for me. And over the years, I've accumulated a pretty decent knowledge set of how I can bend the rules of rod building a little bit, not
Okay.
only from the appearance of how I make rods, but how can I also tailor that specific rod to what the client is looking for, and how it's really just this organic creative side that I like to refer to as an art. I know a lot of
Yeah.
folks paint watercolors or are really good with digital arts, and mine is making fly rods. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's to me it's an art, and I think to a lot of folks it's really becoming that as well.
When you first started exploring the rod building approach or scenario for yourself, were there some expectations that you had that either fell through of, oh, it wasn't as complex or that's much harder than I thought, etc.? Maybe touch base on that.
Yeah. Well, I will say the time it takes to build a rod may seem super trepidatious, right? Because there's oftentimes waiting days for epoxy to dry, or just nailing those wraps that you're putting on a guide to make it look really, really clean, right?
Mm-hmm.
My first rod was an absolute disaster. I think it was a 9 foot three weight that it was, again, my first rod, so I was putting it together for myself just to really familiarize myself with the nuance of building a fly rod. And that first rod didn't look all that great. I will say that. I was wrapping the guides with some Vivus thread that I picked up at the fly shop, thinking that would work, which honestly it did until I broke the rod. But
Right.
you know, the reel seat wasn't sat into the handle, and I didn't know that I had to countersink the handle, so everything looked really nice. I don't think I put any winding checks on there, just these little accents that probably most people don't notice, but as a rod builder, you kind of pick up on as time goes on. So yeah, it really turned from okay, how do I make this actually look like a fly rod, and are there exceptions to the rules of rod building? And yeah, almost really it was just trial by fire and seeing what worked and what didn't.
You talk about a bunch of different characteristics of a fly rod right there, and I've never built a rod, and I haven't spent much time looking at it other than I explored bamboo rods at one time because I thought, oh, that would be kind of neat, and doing a hexagonal filing and shaving and sort of shaping, right?
Hmm.
Um, when you're building a rod, is it a lot like fly tying in that there is a recipe in a specific order that you need to follow in order to be successful?
I will say there's a recipe in the assembly process. Very similar to how a fly is most often tied from the back of the hook to the front of the hook. Most often
Mm-hmm.
I'm putting my rods together from the fighting butt or the reel seat all the way up to the tip top. So there
Okay.
is a little bit of kind of step-by-step process that needs to be incorporated into the building process, but there's also plenty of exceptions to that rule as well, right? There's no one way to wrap a ferrule. There's no one material that's best for inlays, for example. I will say there's
Mm-hmm.
recommendations, but if you
Right.
don't mess around and experiment with the materials you're using, the process itself, and really thinking critically about that, then you're really not tapping into that creative potential that is what rod building has become for me, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find yourself using alternative products that aren't necessarily with a norm? Things like, oh yeah, I got a really high end rod and I'm going to put a foam grip on it because I like a foam grip, or things like that. That
Yeah.
would be my approach of like, I would probably start there with the experimentation. Then I'm an experimentation guy. I think I would be the guy that's like, oh, I'm going to go with a super hard grip because I want to feel the vibration, or I might put
Hmm.
a piece of some other metal material on there because I want that sensitivity. I mean, that's me. Is like just thinking through it out loud. Do you experiment like that, and
Yeah. Yeah.
expand on that for me a little?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, like in the rod building process, I've been experimenting with different materials for uh, a very long time, pretty much since I started building rods. When I first started building rods, I had one of my coworkers approach me and ask if I could utilize a piece of elk antler in a handle, for example.
Yeah.
So that one didn't turn out as well as I would have liked it to, but again, just a great opportunity to learn how to work with a material and really understand the properties. Nowadays, I'm mostly
Right. You're
incorporate.
thinking, sorry, I'm going to interrupt, but
Yeah.
I mean, you said that and I was like, oh man, that sounds really cool. Like a decorative, like kind of cool rod, right? Sweet.
Yeah.
But like you
Yeah.
said, it didn't turn out like I thought it would. But have you thought about going back to that and improving on it, like on a second round? Like, okay, now I know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing when you're messing around with new materials, especially in rod building, is just understanding those characteristics. So given the opportunity, I would love to revisit a rod that incorporated an antler or specific types of wood, for example, for reel seats or handles. All of
Hmm.
those opportunities, when they come up, I jump right on them because I think that reiterating yourself in this kind of creative space is really what helps kind of define your style and also just builds on your knowledge of the medium for lack of better words, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if mediums apply to rod building, but yeah, just really understanding and working with something that can produce a cool result is always really fun.
Yeah. No, it sounds fun. I mean, I don't need another hobby, but
That's what I always tell people too, they'll reach out
uh,
and say like over Instagram, for example, I have folks message me and ask about specific materials. And for what it's worth, I am totally open to sharing my process and my successes and failures with others because I think that's what makes a good community. And that's also what leads to that progression of creativity within this space.
yeah.
So, I'll have folks reach out and say, hey, what is it like to work with this material? Or how did you wrap that ferrule? Or what are your inlays and your handles made out of? And I'm always happy to share that detail.
Yeah. For you, when you started, um, what were some of the primary resources to build your knowledge set? I mean, obviously you're a creative guy, and some of it you just innately kind of worked through, but there had to be a lot of it where you were like, I need to find out what I'm doing here.
Yeah. YouTube University was
Yeah.
was really my best resource. I browsed forums as well, rodbuilding.org. Mudhole, who is based out of Florida, I believe, is a really they're a prominent name in the rod building space. They also have great videos on YouTube that you can look up and
Hmm.
hone in on specific steps in the process, right? So they
Okay.
cover everything from mixing epoxy to reaming a handle to fit onto your rod. XYZ, they're a fantastic resource, and the visuals are also super helpful.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. When you're building a rod yourself, what is the step that you kind of look at as this is never easy. I gotta nail it. Like, let's get ready. Here it comes, and
Yeah.
then kind of break that down as to why it's like that, and like what you do to prepare yourself for success. I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah. So I would say the most crucial step in building a rod is correctly mounting the handle.
Hmm.
Just because if you do it incorrectly, the handle can break, the cork will split, and you've got a really wonky handle. You're also reducing the ability of that fly rod to perform as it's supposed to. So when I first started making custom handles, I this was before I owned a lathe and kind of the tools necessary. This was really just me, again, broke college student, trying to learn how to do this and set myself apart from others, and just kind of finalizing my creative process in that. But basically, what I did was I broke down an old 2x4 and created this weird jig that held a drill, and then I mounted a weird mandrel to it. And so I was the guy out front sanding away with sandpaper. This drill's just humming louder than the entire block, right? And it took a lot of years for me to really kind of nail down how to put together a handle that, one, looks unique and incorporates that creative side, but also functions as it's intended, right? Because I really don't like
So
when fly rods sit on a wall.
right. So
Yeah.
what's different now? So maybe describe
hmm
what you were doing to make a handle and what you've incorporated since to kind of give guys a little jump start there.
Yeah. So when I first started putting together handles, it was really just squishing a bunch of cork together in a little jig press with, your mandrel down the center. And nowadays, what I do is I have a multiple cork press, so I can press together both handles and fighting butts. The lathe that I use is, I will say, it's a pretty cheap lathe off of Amazon, I think. But when we're turning cork, we don't need to use anything too crazy, right?
Right. It's
So
not super hard. Right.
no, it's not a hard material to work with at all. And so, nowadays I utilize tools like a drill press to really nail down the inner diameter of a handle just so it fits well onto your rod. I also
Mm-hmm.
utilize different materials like drywall tape to create arbors to fill that space between the rod blank and the cork if you have to over drill it a little bit. And I also
Mm.
do a lot of handwork with just files to make sure everything is super smooth and it fits correctly in the building process, right? So yeah, I I started out using painter's tape for arbors, and that failed pretty quickly, so I moved to drywall tape. And then I started realizing that the handles coming off the lathe weren't sitting correctly on the rod. They were kind of lopsided, so they needed more filing. And then I had to come up with a better solution for filling that space between the cork. And yeah, again, it's just trial by fire and really coming up with creative ways. And a lot of my handles really incorporate dark cork as well as poured epoxy resin. So I make all of those inlays myself. I color them, I pigment them myself, and I'll drill through them the same process, right? It goes into the handle, I squish it all together, and then I turn it on the lathe. And excuse me, a lot of folks ask kind of what the shaping process is like, and I utilize a lot of wood turning tools, right? So a
Mm.
lot of the tools that you would use in turning a bowl or a cup on a lathe are the same ones that I'm using, but I do
Yep.
spend significantly more time on the sanding process rather than that rough gouging in process, because
Okay.
at the end of the day, you don't want your epoxy inlays to have these striations in them. You want it to be really nice and smooth. You want it to look like glass, and that's really what I strive for, is just that extra level of really nice visual appeal on my rods.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it seems like it would be pretty fun to get into those little inlays and different scenarios and test them and whatnot. And I could see where the turning would be really actually quite fun. I mean, I used to do
Oh,
some wood turning as a kid
yep,
and stuff. And like,
yeah,
already got to have really sharp tools because you're going between a very hard substrate, which is the epoxy, and then the soft cork.
yeah.
Any tips for us there, or guys who are experimenting with that, etc.?
Yeah, so you're totally correct. You got to keep your tools nice and sharp. And so what I have on hand is just a super fine grit sanding uh, kit, basically. Or I'm sorry, not a sanding kit, but a filing kit. And I run a couple of really fine grit files over my tools before I turn anything. And that's just to
Okay.
keep that nice sharp edge on my tools, to be able to not have the epoxy explode in my face as it's turning on the lathe, or just really roughing in the shape of a handle too. It's super
Mm-hmm.
helpful to keep your tools sharp, and just a simple filing kit goes miles in that regard.
And I would assume that if you chip the epoxy, it's very hard to recover from. But if you had a gouge in a cork, you can use some fillers. It's not your
Mm-hmm.
quality that you're necessarily looking for, but there are recovery processes. Maybe a little tip there. Do you use any ground cork in your
Mm-hmm.
filler, or what do you do?
Yeah, yeah. Whenever I'm turning fighting butts specifically, I typically end up backfilling the cork rings, because they usually come with a 1/4 inch diameter hole right in the middle. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
backfill those with 2 ton epoxy, let that set for however long it needs to, and then go in and do my final sanding. So I'll get in there, rough gouge the fighting butt, backfill that little hole, and then 6 to 12 hours later, whenever it's nice and hard and ready to be sanded down, then I'll go in and do those final sandings.
Mm-hmm. What's next on that? Is that a real seat scenario?
Mm-hmm.
Talk a
Yep.
little bit about that and your incorporation and what
Yeah.
you've learned there.
So the build process, definitely for 5 weights and under, usually don't require a fighting butt. If a client asks for it, I'm always happy to entertain and I'll put a fighting butt on a 1 weight. I don't care.
Yeah,
But
great.
so if you're talking about like a 6 weight or above, I usually uh, incorporate a fighting butt, just because it's nice to have, and most oftentimes you're going to use it at some point, right? So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the fighting butt's the first thing that gets glued onto the rod, and then right above that is your reel seat, which holds your reel. And I typically like to use double locking nuts on my reel seats, just to really keep that reel in place without it potentially just falling off your rod at any given point.
Mm-hmm.
And under the reel seat is, again, some of that porous tape, which absorbs the epoxy and holds it in place. And then right on top of that is the handle, with a bit of a counter bore on the butt end, so it can fit over the receiver the top of the reel seat, basically. And it's really just to make it look really nice. I know some folks that don't have countersunk reel seats. I know folks that have down locking, up locking reel seats. So there's so many different options of reel seats,
Mm-hmm.
especially just how you prefer it. I know there's the ring lock reel seats as well, for some of the folks that like to fish kind of the more antique side. So yeah, the customization goes a long way, but through my experience, I've really found that an up-locking, double locking reel seat has performed best, and they hold up well in all conditions.
Yeah. Do you look at counterweight and balance, et cetera, as well when you're selecting your reel seat? Because I mean that would adjust that, being an upward or downward reel seat, et cetera.
Yeah, so I don't build a lot of specifically weighted rods, and I know a lot of the Euro folks have counterweights that they'll put into their rods just to ease the arm strain if you're out there
Mm-hmm.
fishing on your 6th hour and your shoulder's about to fall out of place, right? But
Yeah.
the way that I like to make sure my uh, rods are balanced is, as I'm assembling them, before any epoxy goes onto the rod, I'll make sure that the fighting butt, reel seat, and handle are all fitted where I believe they need to be. And then from there, I'll kind of test the balance, because you really want your rod to balance perfectly in your hand. And you want that butt section to be kind of falling off the back end a little bit. So when you have your entire rod assembled, it balances well.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you can kind of mitigate for an imbalance in your rod is drilling further into your handle, just widening that expanse between the rod blank and the handle,
Mm-hmm.
or doing a similar situation for the fighting butt. And you always have to keep in mind the epoxy that goes into the rod is going to throw that balance off a little bit, but
Right.
there's not too fine of a line. You really just want to make sure that if it fits in your hand and you're holding it up, does it feel good, right? And
Yep. Yep.
and after making hundreds of rods at this point, I think I've kind of got it just dialed in the back of my head. But Before I ever epoxy anything, I just like to make sure that the rod is balanced well right there at the handle. And I'll take my hand out vertically, and I'll just set the rod right kind of on top of my index finger there, and see if it's balanced or close to balance, or if it's just
Right.
rolling right off of my hand.
Right. And it's going to vary because once you put a reel on and the line weight and the line out the tip,
Exactly.
like, there's
Yeah.
a lot of variance in there. And I think the ability to start with where the rod is and the rod is being imbalanced, then, all those other things come into play. I mean, some people like a little bit of a, for lack of a better term, weight forward rod, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the tip does feel a little heavier, or vice versa, because they know they're going to be throwing a lighter line or a heavier line or whatever. So that's one of the great things about custom rods is you can order it on how you want it. Right? It's custom.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's jump
Yeah.
back a little bit. I'm curious to hear. You've mentioned the drywall tape a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Are you using that because you have to create a mechanical bond as well as the chemical bond with the epoxy? When you use that, I heard you say something to the tune of like that wet, it absorbs the epoxy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then I also heard you use it as almost like a filler when you're reaming as, okay, I may be reamed, but I want to have this filler material. So if you could just talk through that a little bit and why that's so important for you.
You bet. Yeah, painter's tape is where I started, right? That blue painter's tape that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. And for what it's worth, painter's tape isn't a terrible option. I actually picked that up, I think, from one of those mud hole videos years ago, right? But what I was kind of having trouble with was fighting butts, especially with the painter's tape. Because the epoxy that I use, this 2-ton epoxy, doesn't usually saturate well into painter's tape.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason I switched to the drywall tape was because it can seep into the drywall tape. And if you're not familiar, drywall tape almost looks like a backyard fence, right? So there's a bunch of open space that's kind of latticed together. And as you
Mm-hmm.
wrap that onto the rod, the epoxy has significantly better ability to sink into that.
Okay, so you're using the mesh drywall tape, not the paper
Yes.
tape.
Yes, correct.
Okay,
Yes.
that
Thanks for
even
that
makes
correction.
more sense
Yep.
from a mechanical bond scenario. Very cool. Okay, and it's strong stuff.
It's very strong. Yeah. Yeah, and
Okay.
usually I don't have to use too much of it. The most that I have to use usually goes into the reel seat. But anytime I'm turning a fighting butt or a handle, I maybe use 1 or 2 layers. And I've found that it holds up really well. So making the switch to the mesh drywall tape was definitely the move for me.
Okay. So for those that are listening, the mesh drywall tape, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially like a screen material, and
Exactly.
but in a tape form. It's usually 3-4 inches wide, and it's actually woven, but it's like a plastic material.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very durable. And I get it now. So yeah, if you're using it to fill space, but the primary aspect is to really give yourself texture to mechanically bond to. I mean, a chemical bond is one thing, but having that mechanical bond in addition to that would significantly improve the strength.
Exactly. Yeah, the one thing that I was struggling most with the blue painter's tape was that there was really no texture to it. So it was very slick, and the bond wasn't there, right? And for what it's worth, I really only had issues with the blue painter's tape on some of my larger saltwater reels, or saltwater rods. But yeah, the mesh tape just seems to really be the best solution for bonding your reel seats and your fighting butts, handles, all that to your rod.
Yeah, and I could see the blue tape being problematic. It's almost got like a waxy coating on it.
Exactly. Yeah, there's too much going on with the blue tape. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have another adhesive in there and everything else. So very cool. All right, we're going to get to the details here. Something that I know everybody wants to talk about, and that's the wraps. tell us about the wrap scenario because, I mean, there's an infinitesimal number of ways to do it and get creative, etc.
Hmm.
I think I would love to hear your perspective of, hey, for your first rod, maybe try this. For
Yeah.
your fifth rod, maybe experiment with this, etc.
So there are plenty of different materials you can use for guide wraps, or ferrule wraps, for that matter as well. I typically stick with a color fast pro wrap thread, and I believe that's most often sold through Mudhole, but I believe they're a separate company. And within that, there's a lot of different words that I just use for that single type of thread. So a color fast thread is a thread that won't change color when you apply your final epoxy to it. With a non-color fast thread, colors typically end up changing to the darker side, right? So if I put a tan wrap on a guide, it'll usually end up looking brown if it's non-color fast. If it is color fast, it'll maintain that color. So that's one of
Okay.
the biggest
That's pretty
distinctions.
critical, right? I
Exactly.
mean, most
Yep.
people immediately look at wraps from a visual perspective, not necessarily the strength or whatever. So, okay,
Right.
that's good to know.
Right. Yeah. There are some solutions to that as well. If you do have a non-color fast thread that you want to make color fast, there's color preservers and thread finishers out there, which folks can use. I use those for certain threads that I can only pick up in non-color fast. So there are
Mm-hmm.
solutions to that. And then on top of
Or
that, you
materials
also
that you're like, hey, I already own this and I want to, I don't want to go
exactly.
spend more on new thread for one rod. I'll
Mhm.
use this, it sounds like a color
Color
preservation.
fast, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yep, color preserver and thread finisher, yep.
Okay.
Um, and then, on top of that, you also have different thread materials. So nylon is probably one of the most common threads that you'll find on a majority of fly rods. If you look to the bamboo side and some of the antique side, you'll see a lot of silk thread. And those are
Mm-hmm.
really cool because those can turn completely transparent. So one of the rods that I wanted to make when I was first starting out was a rod that had zero thread wraps visible, at least, right? So I chose a natural non-dyed silk, and that comes out as completely transparent when the rod is finished and you put that
Wow.
epoxy on it. So silk
That's
and
cool.
nylon
That's
are,
cool. I
are
would have
two
never
of
thought of
the
that.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And silk probably predates the nylon by a few hundred years at this
Yeah.
point, but people are still reaching for it just because it has such interesting characteristics when you work with it.
Yeah. And it's super strong stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
really
exactly.
neat.
Yeah. So, outside of that, I mean, I'm sure you could come up with a bunch of other different uh, thread or material combinations that could work for you, but the two that I'm most familiar with and utilize on a daily basis are going to be those nylon color fast, non-color fast threads, as well as some of the silk threads as well.
Now, did you practice your wrapping on like a sample blank or something first, or did you just dive right in? And what would you recommend to the group?
I would recommend that. Well, I dove in head first, and that probably wasn't the the best means to go about it. If for someone at home, if they're only building one rod, I
Yeah.
would definitely recommend taking some test wraps. And the best way to do that is just to head to the hardware store, pick up a wooden dowel or an aluminum dowel, whatever you can get your
Okay.
hands on, and just
Throw it
practice
in
with
your
some
drill
sewing
chuck.
thread. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, the one thing that I really like to pay attention to as I'm wrapping is that all of my thread wraps are cohesive and touching. So you don't want to have any big spaces in your thread wraps. You don't want your thread to be overlapping itself at any point. And that really just comes from practice and attention to detail. So the practice phase is definitely something to consider if you're only looking to build one rod or just dip your hands into it. A little bit of time practicing will definitely help.
When you start, I would assume your first few wraps are absolutely critical
Mm-hmm.
because if they're not straight, it's going to set up everything else. In addition to that, I would assume, and I'm going to use my fingers here, but if you ever wrap and you're like having to nudge it every once in a while to keep it tight or something like that, that eventually that's going to come back and bite you. Is that true? What are some of the techniques that you've learned to get yourself off to the start, you know, in the right path?
Yeah, that's a hugely important point. Your first wraps are absolutely your most important wraps, and you want those first wraps to not even be on the guide that you're wrapping onto the rod. So you want to have those first 3 to 4 turns of that thread very tight to the blank. And once you get those first couple of turns that way, after that you can start moving up onto the guide foot, which will secure your guide down. But if you do have those little variations or those little weak spots as you're wrapping, I highly suggest fixing them as soon as possible, because you're leaving to chance the possibility for spacing in your thread wraps to occur. And really what we're going for is the strongest bond possible with those guides. You don't want a guide popping out as you're fighting a 150-pound tarpon, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, making sure that your thread wraps are nice and secure and cohesive is super important. And the best way that I've found to mitigate any potential for spaces opening up as I'm wrapping the guides is to maintain just an ever so slight angle of the thread onto your guide. So rather than having your thread wrap directly perpendicular to the rod, I like to keep a slight angle facing the previous wraps. And so that ensures that the next wrap that you lay down kind of rolls over that previous wrap and falls as snug to it as possible. That angle is
Okay.
super hard to to really lock down, but with practice, it comes pretty easily.
I mean, it sounds almost an exact parallel to fly tying, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you
Yep.
put your first few wraps on the shank, and then you start to tie in your material. And, you know, on the finish wraps, it's really important. Maybe not on the starting wraps, but the same kind of thing. I always use that, like you said, that kind of, all right, I have my thread twisted the right way. And if it lands on the last piece of thread just at that little bit of an angle, it's going to roll right into place. So I would assume that the next kind of hurdle to overcome is when you lay your eyelet down, and now you have these flat wraps that are on the ferrule, right? The rod blank, and then you're having to transition into this hump of metal.
Yes.
So how do you keep? What are your little techniques there for keeping that gap super tight so you don't see any of that metal and it's really clean?
This is something that took me years of practice to really get down. When you're buying your guides or your eyelets for a fly rod, usually they'll come in either 2 varieties, right? Well, there's plenty of varieties, but for this example, we have unfiled and filed guides. So when I pick up guides, they're unfiled because I like to do it myself. But what I'll do is I'll take that guide in my hand and I'll run it against a flat file just to create a little bit of a slope, right? And again, you don't want it to be too high. You don't want it to be too shallow. You really, again, it's just practice. So if you're looking to only put together one fly rod, I would get them pre-filed, just because when they do it at the factory, they nail it right off the bat. But you are going to pay a little bit more for that extra step in creating those guides. So it's really important just to ensure that angle that is moving from the very tip of that guide foot up to that flat, the main body of that guide foot. Just nail that angle. It for whatever reason, this creative process always comes down to angles, it seems. But yeah, just taking the extra time and wrapping slow too. If it doesn't look good, very similar to fly tying. If your material doesn't look good, take it out and do it again, right? Rather than just pushing through it and hoping it'll shape up in the end. Just fix it right then and there, and you're way better off than if you didn't.
Okay, cool. Well, we covered quite a bit. I wish we could cover everything. Do you have some examples maybe you can kind of show us? Those of you that are listening, you might not be able to see this. We'll try to describe it as best as possible. If you want to check it out in more detail, head over to our YouTube channel, Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. You'll be able to see the video. But yeah, Lance, if you have some things you could show, it'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm currently working on this 6-weight right now. And so I turned this handle. It's dark cork with some tan cork on each end. And I've got a little bit of that custom poured epoxy in several layers right there in the middle. And you can see this is kind of like a dark blue. You may not be able to pick it up. There's also holographic flakes in there. And this is shaped in what is called a full wells shape, right? So this is a pretty common shape for some of your larger weight rods. And it gives you a really nice profile and it fits in your palm really well. The reel seat I chose for this one is a carbon fiber tube. And I really think that's just the aesthetic. I'm not going to say anything about the weight of this reel seat versus another because it's probably nominal. But yeah, and again, right at the end there, I've got another inlay of that blue holographic right there on the fighting butt.
Oh, yeah, I see that. Okay, on the fighting butt.
And this is where I'm talking about where I kind of backfill that hole in the cork. There's usually a hole right down the middle of this fighting butt, but I just filled it in with some cork shavings. So yeah, this is the 6-weight. I've got another tip section here I'm actually working on. And so this is what I'm talking about when you're really trying to get those nice cohesive wraps, really tight on the rod. And then you can also see one of my favorite things to do is put down some of this special tape that I buy for the ferrules. And what I do is I just epoxy over the whole thing. It keeps them nice and strong. And yeah, so this one's actually going to be up for sale on my website pretty soon. But that's one of the, I think, 3 or 4 I'm currently working on right now.
Cool. What's the website if people want to go check it out?
Yeah, so I put all of my custom rods that are for sale to the general public, just ones that I've built on my website, and it is pescavita.net.
Okay, pescavita.net. All right, so you guys can check that out if you want. Pescavita on Instagram and TikTok too. Lots of good tutorials on both subjects here. We're gonna continue on. We're gonna jump into your tips around the tools and materials that you can pick up outside of the fly shop. So that was a tongue twister for me, but we got the custom rod now, so you need something to fling with that beauty, and that's flies. And a lot of us we like to tie our own. So I'm one of those guys. I used to tie a lot more. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be, so I don't do that. But I remember perusing the Michaels and Walmarts and all the other places that I could go to pick up materials. One of the best places I found was thrift stores, because you could pick up cheap fur coats with like fox and all kinds of weird stuff, which is great for saltwater flies. So I'm really interested to hear what you got here, Lance. I know there's some cool tools we've talked about.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I do a lot of fly tying tutorials as well on all my social media pages, and that's probably what I'm most known for, just kind of off that face appeal. The rod building is just kind of the fun part, but I'm right there with you. As much as I love to support my local fly shops, which I highly encourage people to do, there are certain points where it's just better to go to a general store and pick up a couple of, quick things that you may need. So I've got
that's a great point. I think everybody likes their local fly shop and they support them, etc. And I do too. But at the same standpoint, I'm a fly tire. I buy so much junk. It's like ridiculous. I got bins of it, and then you get home and you're like, oh, I need this. You're like, what? You got so much stuff here. Why do you need that? So that's funny.
And it's always funny because everyone thinks they're going to start tying flies to save money. And at least for me, it has not gone that route.
But I got far more fly materials than I do flies. That's for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So I like to keep it cheap for a couple of the things that I use on a daily basis, whether I'm filming reels for Instagram or TikTok or completing custom orders for some customers. One of the tools that I actually picked up recently are some of these chip clips. And I think I bought these at Walmart right there in the kitchen section. It's like a 2-pack of just these real cheap chip clips. And what I do with these is I will add CDC feathers, or I will add rabbit strips, whatever I'm using at that time to create a dubbing loop, right? And
Yep.
there are different clips out there that are often carried in fly shops that are just a little bit more expensive. These were like $1.50 for both of them, right? So these are really helpful whenever I'm creating dubbing loops with feathers and fur. You can just add your material right in. And you can also, the nice thing about having two clips is you can add your material on one side, get it all aligned, and then come in with your second clip, pick up the tips of that material, and then trim out the butt ends if you were, say, using a rabbit strip. So that's one thing I like use very often. Yeah. Yeah.
I like it. I'm similar in nature.
Yeah.
I took some, they were TV or refrigerator magnet clips.
There you go. Another great option.
Same thing. I use this one here. See if this can come into focus. Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
This is for holding back. It's really tiny. That's what I use on my vise to hold materials back when I'm tying in.
I think I've got the exact same one right here on my vise.
When you're tying streamers and things like that. So yeah, cool.
So that's a super helpful material just to make those dubbing loops a little bit easier. The next material that I have is the adhesive foam sheets that you'll find in the crafts section. These are conveniently 2 millimeters, which are, I would say I use 2 millimeter foam the most whenever I'm tying a foam hopper or whatever the foam fly is. But the nice thing too about this is the adhesive backing. So if you wanted to double up a couple of pieces, say you're tying a GFA hopper or something similar that requires a little bit more breadth in your foam, you can always glue 2 of them together just using that adhesive, and it sticks really well. And it comes in, I think it's probably 10 colors, huge sheets, multiple sheets as well. And it's like $5.
Yeah. One of the things that I found, I think it was at Michael's, is they had a roller style cutter. And nice. I use that. It's really nice for cutting foam and things and getting a really tight line. You can measure it out. Metal. I use a metal. Let's see here. Little measure,
Oh yeah,
like, okay, line that thing up. It's real sharp. And then boom, roll that down on it, and it makes a real nice fine cut. Super repeatable, right? Because that's you're like you said, you're tying hippie stompers or something like that. It's like I want the same piece every time. Make them look really good.
Yeah, and the roller idea is actually a really good idea. I'm actually gonna have to pop over to Michael's and see if I can find something. That's something I haven't thought about.
Yeah, any fabric store you can pick them up. It's like a roller cutter. All it is it's almost like a mini pizza wheel, but it's very sharp.
Oh, nice.
And if you have it on a hard surface, I usually use like one of those Walmart, like real thin sheets that are cutting boards.
Oh, right? Yeah, like the or not silicone, but yeah, just like a little cutting board.
They're just a hard plastic sheet, but you put it on that thing and they even have real nice ones at the fabric stores that have measurements on them and everything, and that helps. I would honestly say it's probably worth doing that, spending an extra few bucks if you tie a lot of flies. But if you're, just wanting something cheap, the other ones work really well too. Just don't use it on your Formica countertop or something. You'll probably scratch the crap out of it.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
Your wife
definitely
is get
the cutting board.
Right.
Too funny. So my next material that I always pick up from Walmart, I have a couple examples here, but the selection is endless, and that's going to be their beads, right? So over here in my right hand, I have these really tiny beads that I use for midges. I believe these are called seed beads. I also use these glass E-beads for connecting articulated streamers together. And I also actually use some that are a little bit bigger than this for some really big flies. But just browsing around the beads section of Walmart is going to provide you with thousands of beads. And you can choose, small, large, you can choose the color, you can get a mix pack, right? So they've got plenty of bead options. And my Walmart, for what it's worth, is pretty small. So, head over to that craft section, peruse. They probably have what you need in like 80 different colors.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of things out there that are pretty handy. to get into. The beads are, of course, one of them that's real easy. And any other tips that you have for us with regard to materials and how you've experimented along the way?
So one of the flies that I tie most often, and one that folks would probably recognize, are the articulated streamers that use laser dub for the head, right? This kind of like yarn material. And crazy enough, that's exactly what it is. So my last material is just, I think it's called a skein or a skein of yarn. And these are $5 over at Walmart. And this is more yarn than I would ever use in 14 lifetimes for tying flies. But there's a couple important things to consider here. When I'm making my own laser dub for a custom fly, I use yarn that is 100% acrylic. And that helps mostly with water shedding as you're casting the fly, but it also still provides a decently bulky profile to push a little bit of water. So anytime I'm making laser dub, I'll just find the end of the yarn and I'll cut these into maybe 1.5 to 2-inch sections. And then what I do is I'll run that through like a fine hair brush, right? For like a dog or a cat. Pull it all apart, and then I'll realign all those fibers once you kind of deconstruct the yarn, because this is twisted up. So you really just want to pull out all of the twists and get the real fuzzy stuff. But again, it comes in 1,002 different colors. It's super cheap, and this is way more yarn than I'll ever need. I'm trying to pawn it off on my wife if she can use it on, some of her projects.
Something,
but,
right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those are kind of my basics. Just peruse Walmart, get creative, and keep in mind that there are a lot of materials you can get crafty with.
Yeah, man. I really appreciate it. It's been cool learning about the rod process and your tips on fly tying. You've got some amazing flies I've seen online, and of course the rods are beautiful, etc., and very unique. So, thanks again for coming on to the show, Lance. I'm really looking forward to getting you back to talk about your conservation projects. So we're going to do that as well. For this week, guys, that's all we've got. Lance, thanks again, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Christian.